In this tutorial, we'll be focusing on the 4-bet pots between the small blind and the big blind. So let's first take a look at the preflop ranges, and then we'll go and look at some post-flop play. So in the sims that we wanted to look at, the small blind is going to be opening to 3 big blinds, and the big blind will 3-bet to 9 big blinds. The small blind then has to choose which size to 4-bet. If we look at this particular preflop simulation, we've got the small blind essentially choosing 2 different sizes as their 4-bet. The small size is around 50 to 60% 4-bet size. In other words, around 18 to 20 big blinds. The other size is mainly based around the ace-king offsuit hand, and it goes up to as high as 30 big blinds in some situations. However, mostly goes around 25 to 27 big blinds. So let's first take a look at the response against the small 4-bet, and then we'll take a look at the response against the large 4-bet. Here, this 18 big blind 4-bet needs to be called fairly wide out of the big blind. Reason being, the big blind essentially gets very good odds. If we look at the weighted mode, the big blind will be calling this 4-bet with a lot of their suited hands and weaker pocket pairs, choosing to go for the 5-bet all-in with hands like pocket 10, pocket jacks, ace-king offsuit, some of the weaker suited aces. There is a small 5-bet size focused around pocket kings, ace-king suited, and pocket queens. Let's turn off the weighted mode and look at the exact hands which essentially fold. The big blind will be folding only 37%, and these hands which fold are essentially these weak suited trash hands. This 10-5 to 10-2, jack-5 to jack-2. These weaker aces, weaker kings in the offsuit variant. You notice a lot of these suited hands aren't included in the range. In other words, they're not being 3-bet preflop. The weaker suited aces are all going to be continuing, as well as the weaker suited kings when they choose to 3-bet. Now let's take a look at what happens if the small blind goes for the big 4-bet size. Let's take a look at 27. So pod it back. Now here, when the small blind goes to the large 4-bet size, the big blind will be folding significantly more, here up to 57% of the range, and will be folding many more hands, particularly these offsuit hands. On the other side of the coin, the big blind will be 5-betting all in much more frequently, with fairly weak hands all the way down to sort of pocket 5s, queen jack suited as a semi-bluff, and all the ace king. If you notice, in both situations, the big blinds will be trapping with the pocket aces. Pocket aces essentially dominating everything that the small blind will be 4-betting with. The small blind's 4-bet at 100 big blinds deep is not particularly polar for the small size, and even for the large size, it is not incredibly polar, given the fact that the remaining stack to pot ratio will just be around 1. So that being said, the small blind will be betting at a very high frequency on most flops, and so the small blind will be essentially putting themselves at a very juicy spot for the big blind to trap. Now, let's take a look at some post-flop simulations. Sorry for the flashbang. Let's take a look at the small 4-bet size out of the small blind and the big blind call. And we're going to be looking at some of the lower flops, which a lot of players tend to have trouble with. Now, if we look at the overall equity in these 20 low flops, the small blind here in blue is going to have on average 52% equity. This is because a lot of the hands which the small blind it goes for the 4-bet will have missed. We look at the 4-bet ranges again quite briefly. The small blind will 4-bet a lot of bluffs with either a king or an ace in them. And so when these low cards hit the board, the small blind will miss. That being said, the small blind does continuation bet at a very high frequency, more than half the time. Let's take a look at some of these flops. We'll shift it to the equity. And let's take a look at a board which is going to be better for the small blind here with this relatively high equity of 57%. 57% is this 4-3-3. These paired boards going to be fairly good for the small blind, fairly high equity for the small blind, betting at a very high frequency. On these sort of low paired boards, ace king ends up with 63% equity, ace king suited, and ace king offsuit around 60%, meaning that these hands like ace king can essentially value bet the flop. Remember, when you're out of position, you don't have to get called by quite as many strong hands in order to go for a value bet for a small size. The big blind betting around half pot and 1/3 pot with hands like this. And the big blind also has a very high density of the overpairs. All very clear value out of the big blind. So half pot here, and the big blind needs to call with essentially all of their ace highs. These very weak ace highs can, particularly the offsuit hands, can start to fold. Ace 7, ace 6 without the backdoor can fold out. But the big blinds will be calling essentially all of their ace highs and calling a significant amount of their suited king highs, as well as obviously the draws, 7-6, 6-5 with a gut shot. So these ace highs and these king highs are very much dominated by ace king in the small blind's betting range. And so ace king actually becomes a very clear value bet on the flop. If we end up turning an ace after the big blind calls, ace king out of the small blind here will be very much loving it, even though this particular turn card is going to be significantly better for the big blind overall, because the big blind has so many ace-x hands which they call to flop. So the small blind keeps blasting off with the ace-king, calling down with these top pairs out of the big blind, essentially never folding an ace. Okay, let's take a look at what happens if we get a low card, say for example, the 8 of clubs. On the 8 of clubs, the small blind with their out of position weaker pocket pairs will want to deny a lot of equity, and they can do that by jamming all in with hands like pocket 9s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks. After the flop call, the big blind's high card hands will be fairly Broadway focused, ace queen, king queen, and these hands will still have a significant amount of equity against the small blind's pocket pairs. You look at the hand versus hand comparison, they'll have about 14%. And on the other hand, if you're sitting here with pocket 10s or pocket 9s, if one of the overcard comes to the board on the river, you won't really know where you're at, and you'll have to essentially bet all in anyway. So for example, half pot, call, king. If you have a hand like pocket jacks, the stack to pot ratio is so small that you're going to put all the money in anyway and get called by stronger hands. So bet all in, call. Bet half pot. Also in the big blind, for the same reason, the big blind will be jamming all in with the 10s, 9s, jacks and even ace queen as a semi-bluff jam all in. You're going to get worse hands to fold, and you're going to have a significant amount of equity against better hands, and weaker flush draws will be calling you anyway. All right, let's take a look at another board, maybe one that's more dynamic and probably better for the big blind. Let's take a look at 6-5-4 with a flush draw. Here in this situation, when there's a flush draw on the board, the big blind will have a significant amount of flush draws. Here, 7.31% for the small blind. But if we look at how many flush draws the big blind has, it's going to be 13.6%. And these flush draws will often have 50% roughly equity against the other player, being 2 overcards and the flush draw. So hands like this King 10 of diamonds, 9-8 of diamonds is the flush draw with the gut shot. Jack 9 of diamonds is a flush draw with 47% equity. And that's one of the weaker flush draws in the big blind's range. So the high density of flush draws in the big blind's range allows the big blind to defend more easily against bets out of the small blind. On the other hand, the small blind will be sitting out of position with a lot of these marginal pocket pairs and will want to be betting to deny the equity from the big blind's overcards. So the small blind will often bet fairly big. Here, 3/4 pot with hands like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks, and pocket queens. Betting 3/4 pot, snapping off the all-in with those same hands, and essentially hoping that the big blind has a relatively weak hand to fold, noting that the big blind will have a fair amount of made straights over pairs with pocket aces through pocket jacks and some pocket queens themselves, as well as very strong hands such as these 2 pairs and sets that will fairly happily trap and get the money in on a later street. These smaller sizes, these smaller raise sizes with sort of pocket 8s, pocket 7s, essentially are an all-in because it'll be a jam and everything will call. So that's a thing that solvers do when everything looks the same. It kind of splits across everything, even though it's effectively the same as an all-in. All right. Bet very high jamming frequency here, more than 20%. Call. So for example, we get a 2, which is a relative brick on this sort of board, and all the other pairs just rip it on the turn. Check. Bet, say for example, 1/10 of the pot. All right, look, this orange size is 1/10 of the pot, and the small blind here will basically be folding everything or ripping it in with those same hands. Bet jam all in, all the traps from the previous street, snap it off, and then a lot of these hands down the bottom here with a significant amount of equity will be forced to call and not really love it. So less than 50% equity with those weaker made hands and draws. On the other hand, if the small blind checks the flop and the big blind goes for a small bet, say for example 1/10 of the pot here in pink, 1/10 or 20% of the pot, the small blind will go for a raise with those same hands like these overpairs for a fairly chunky check raise size, snapping off the jam with the overpairs. It's a slightly bigger bet. There'll be slightly smaller check raises and a slightly higher frequency because there won't need to be as many overpair hands to protect on the turn. 10%, all these ace highs will essentially call, brick on the turn, check, bet half pot, check jam with those weaker overpairs, trapping with the aces. So one thing to note out of both players is that pocket aces really loves to trap, especially in position, but even out of position, because it essentially can play as if it was an ace high, double blocks ace high out of the opponent's range, and in 4-bet pots, ace high will make a lot of the check down, will make a large percentage of the check down line for both players. So say, for example, here, bet 20%, call, check, check. A lot of that is going to be ace high. Let's say another 2. Check again. A lot of these is going to be ace high. And a lot of ace high is going to check down. So with pocket aces, makes for a really good trap. Out of position, if ace a bet, and pocket aces is absolutely loving it. And these ace highs are indifferent between bluff catching and with the call and folding. Now, in these check down lines, when the board pairs, ace king will be a weak value hand against weaker ace highs. If the board doesn't pair, even then, ace king can go for a really small size, such as this 25%. Although I imagine if we run the sim with a 10% bet size, the ace king will use that size fairly readily. Aces, once again, when there's a very high density of ace high in the range, will very happily trap. Check. Aces needs to go for the bet, essentially being the nuts here. And weaker ace highs will go for the call, and other hands will snap it off, such as pair of 4s, pair of 5s. So in these check down lines, even though this board is fairly dynamic, seems like there could be a lot of strong hands for both players. Ace high still needs to make it the showdown and do a lot of bluff catching. Let's take a look at one more example, a little bit in the middle here. This 7-7-6 will be a little bit less good for the small blind in the fact that the 7 and the 6 adds more draws to the big blind's range. The weaker overpairs, such as the 10s and the jacks, goes for a bigger size more frequently to deny more equity from the overcards in the big blind's range, and makes it slightly less devastating when one of those overcards peels off. So say, for example, check call and there's a king. The pocket jacks, pocket 10s will still shovel the rest of the money in, get called by hands like ace high and every weaker pair. There's an ace, then hands like pocket jacks and pocket 10s will want to go for a very small bet. And if they get raised, they'll be indifferent between calling and folding. Against a small raise, they're still going to be going for the call. So there's a 25%, rip it in. Weaker hands, the flush draws are going to be weaker than that. Those are going to be trips. So these pocket jacks and pocket 10s are ripping it in, hoping that the remaining 10%, hoping that the opponent has one of these bluff hands. Brick on the turn with the 2, these overpairs rip it in. For one of these smaller sizes, say for example 35% or 50%, there's going to be a lot of ace highs in that particular range, mainly this ace king for value. Half pot, say weaker ace highs, draws, king highs, they're all going to be calling. Brick on the turn, ace king rips it in as a value jam out of position. Remember, out of position if the stack pot ratio is low, you don't have to get called by quite as many weaker hands in order for it to still be a value jam, because the alternative is checking and your hand is still near the top of your range, and you'll get all the money in anyway. So ace king jams it in for value, it gets called by plenty of worse hands. If it goes check, check, and we get, say for example, a jack, ace king can go for a small bet for quarter pot. Undercard, ace king goes for a small bet for half pot, once again for value, getting called by ace queen high. And obviously if it gets jammed into, it'll be indifferent. Check, jam into it. You see the ace king is not really in there, but it will snap it off anyway. So this small bet represents an overbet, a value bet, sorry, with the ace king. If we look at some of the other lines, say for example, checking down, check, and check back. Here, let's take a quick look at the big blind's betting range for this 20%. It's going to be fairly high frequency. Any ace king is going to be a value bet. Ace queen is going to be a value bet for 20%. Weak ace highs have to call. Any overpair that raises, you'll essentially get all the money in with ace queen yourself, having a significant amount of equity on the flop. But if it checks back and we do get the brick, we check through again. Here on the turn, any traps with these overpairs will quite frequently bet. Pocket tens having missed the check raise. Here it was going for the check raise. Having missed the check raise, will just lead out itself. Pocket nines, pocket jacks as well. Will just lead out itself for a pot size bet and then just jam the river. Kind of regardless of which card it is, with the exception of maybe an ace or a queen. Because there's a significant amount of ace queen in the calling range here. These ace highs are going to be ace queen, and there's going to be a bit of king queen there. Check and check back again for the big blind. If we do get a queen, these are hands like pocket kings is going for the trap, pocket jacks is going for a bluff catch. Check, ace queen overbets, and pocket kings and pocket aces happily gets the rest of the money in. If there's an ace, there's going to be a lot of aces for both players now, because remember, on these sort of low paired boards, even if it's not paired, the aces will go for very check down heavy lines. Here, 25% bet size with these top pair hands, and hands like ace king, ace queen. The reason why these hands are trapping is because of the pocket queens and pocket kings, as well as king high hands, king queen high, which will have to check and then bluff catch. Check, 3/4 pot, got king queen bluff catching. So that means that a lot of these top pairs, particularly this ace jack, ace queen, are going for value against king queen high. And if they get jammed on, the ace queen is snapping it off, because the ace queen out of the small blind is the value jam, and then ace jack is the bluff catcher. 25% you get raised. Similar situation here. These top pairs are now indifferent. Even though it's checked down and you've gone for essentially two bets, one bet on the river and then one raise, the ace highs, these top pairs are indifferent. They're not snapping it off. If we look at a brick on the river, say for example a 10, ace king and ace queen high can go for really thin value. Say for example 25%, and king queen has to bluff catch, or the ace highs will snap it off. Against 50%, similarly, all the ace highs will snap it off. So ace king can go for a bigger value bet on the river. And then hands like top pairs with the 10, over pairs, 3 of a kinds, these hands can all go fairly big, 150, and even ripping it in. If there was a size between 150 and all in, they'd probably be used with hands like a 10, and ace highs will be bluff catching. All right, so we've looked at the preflop ranges, and we looked at some of these low boards in the small blind versus big blind 4-bet pots. We've covered preflop as well. And in these low boards, we've seen that a lot of the ace highs will take fairly showdown heavy lines and be indifferent when calling river bets. In contrast, the overpairs, particularly the weaker overpairs such as pocket tens and pocket jacks, will want to get a lot of the money in on many of these lower flops because they want to deny equity from overcards coming on the turn and making it more difficult to know, essentially, to know where you're at. The remainder of the range helps to cover certain corner situations such as making trips, making flushes, making straights on these more dynamic boards. But the bulk of both players' ranges will be ace high and pocket pairs. In the big blind, of course, the big blind will have more flush draws because they call with plenty of suited connected hands pre-flop, those hands being 3-bets, and then call the 4-bet. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you all in the next one.